Okay, so William Clifford is connecting these two senses, okay, of being sort of factually wrong and morally wrong. Sometimes we don't think of sort of equating those two things, but there's a connection to be made. That, in other words, your beliefs, your stance on factual issues carries with them real world consequences. So it's not like, well, you have your opinion and I have my opinions, and let's agree to disagree. No, like some beliefs are wrong, and some wrong beliefs carry with them negative consequences. And he's going to go even further. He's going to say, it is morally wrong. You sort of bear a moral liability, even when you have a false belief which does not carry with it negative consequences. So he's kind of taking a little bit more Kantian, like on principle, not even in terms of utilitarian and consequence. On principle, you should not have, you should seek to avoid any belief which is not established. Okay, so let's jump into this. So the essay is the Ethics of Belief by William Clifford. So he has two principles here, if it's not going to lag on me. So basically, now we also have to question this, because you might say this is a little bit too stringent, but basically we have a sort of a moral obligation to always seek out a sufficient basis or sufficient evidence for our beliefs. And he's going to say every one of our beliefs. Now, can we do that in some sense? Pragmatically speaking, can you, we always act on beliefs, okay? Are we in a position, this is more of a sort of epistemological kind of consideration. Are you always in a position to verify the basis of your beliefs? Are you always able to seek out the evidence to verify or justify your beliefs? The answer is simply no, okay? We have to act on things without being, I'm not an expert on all the things that I believe in, that I act upon. We are all acting on sort of limited information. So I'm going to give a kind of a, not a kind of a counter argument, but a kind of a supplemental argument that we get with William James. And what William James is another philosopher, and William James is going to say, this is good, but not so tight. Okay, that basically what William James is going to say is, it's okay to have beliefs that you do not know for certain. You don't have the justification, or you can act on. In some sense, you're going to say you have to act on beliefs. It's just a kind of a matter of fact that we have to act on information which is incomplete. So what he's going to say is, you have to look at your beliefs and your actions more as a kind of a probabilistic gamble, as like, what if I'm right and what if I'm wrong? Okay, I'm not in a position, I don't have the time and the resources to definitively know that I am right or that I am wrong, but we can do this kind of secondary analysis of what results from me potentially being right or me potentially being wrong. Okay, so that's a kind of a more interesting, and he sees it as kind of a practical, pragmatic solution to dealing with subjective, limited information, but nonetheless having to take a stance on things and having to act on beliefs. Okay, so this basically, now this is what came to my mind a few days ago. Is, for instance, if you think about an obvious example, would be, let's say, something that's quite rampant, such as, let's say, pseudoscience nowadays and conspiracy theories. You see that, for instance, if you take, let's say, I don't know, it's a specific example. Like, I'll give you some concrete examples, but let's say any example of, let's say, pseudoscience, let's say, hydroxychloroquine and all this stuff, and then kind of conspiracy theories of, anti-vaxxing and QAnon and all this stuff. You see that there is a relationship between sort of one's belief and potential moral impact, so that we get now, as a sort of a societal and political issue in this day and age, the problem of widespread misinformation, like systemic misinformation through social media and all this stuff, which basically turns pseudoscience and conspiracy theory into an actual like societal issue that we need to address, because it's gonna like, it can get out of hand. Let's say, you know, climate change denialism and all this stuff. This is kind of like conspiracy theories that arise in and of themselves spontaneously for whatever reason, or you know, conspiracy theories or pseudoscience that are deliberately sort of nudged along and funded by various economic and like or interests, as we talked about right at the beginning of the semester with let's say deliberate climate change misinformation and so on. Okay, but basically it's morally wrong to be factually wrong, and that's an interesting association to make. So this is kind of his two principles, and we need to unpack this. He's going to say, it is wrong always everywhere for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Okay, so basically, if you believe in something, you have to have some basis for it. But again, going back to what William Clifford is going to respond is, yeah, ideally, yes, but practically, this is impossible. We have to act on things for which we are not in a position because we either lack expertise or because of you know, resource constraints or time constraints. We do not have all the information, yet we nonetheless need to act. But yes, ideally, you should not, you should be, this is a point. Now I need to unpack this a little bit further, but let me read the second one and come back to this because I want to make an important point. The second principle it is wrong always everywhere for anyone to ignore evidence that is relevant to his beliefs or to dismiss relevant evidence in a trivial kind of a way. So basically, we should avoid what we're all prone to, which is confirmation bias. You can kind of combine confirmation. What is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias is the tendency for us to seek out information which already aligns with our presuppositions and our assumptions. We like to feel that we're right, and therefore we like to seek out evidence and resources and news articles and sources which already align themselves up with our views. And then you add to that, you know, social media algorithms and so on, and you have a doubling effect of confirmation bias, because we already have a sort of, it's already part of our psychology. We like to think that we're right, and we like information that gives us the sense that we're right. Okay, and so we already have that sort of psychologically, we're already rigged that way. And then social media doubles down on that, because whatever you search for, it's going to continue giving you more of the same. Okay, so you know, if you're pro-Trump, it's going to keep giving you more and more pro-Trump, and if you're anti-Trump, it's going to keep giving you anti-Trump, to the point where it just looks like all the evidence that you're exposed to is only confirming your inherent biases, and therefore it becomes inconceivable to understand the opposite point of view. How could anybody think other than I do when I'm being overwhelmed by a tidal wave of information which confirms what I already know to be true? Okay, so in other words, the people on the other side, whatever it may be of this issue, that political issue, they must be stupid. Okay, because look at all the evidence. Everything that I look at, everything that the internet shows me is telling me what I already know. So, you know, it's like, so you get into these kind of echo chambers and you get deeper polarization. So there's that. And then you can add another one, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, again, everybody thinks that they have some kind of expertise. Everybody thinks that, what is the Dunning-Kruger effect? Dunning-Kruger effect is people that don't know much overestimate how much they actually know. And so that's generally true across the population. If you survey people on any given issue, on any given competency, people overestimate how good they actually are. But sadly and paradoxically, it's disproportionately true the lower you go. So in other words, an expert understands the complexities and the nuances of what they study, and so they will more likely assess their knowledge to what there actually is, because you understand in some sense knowing more makes you humble, because you realize all the anomalies and all the exceptions and all the nuances that make things complex. Okay, but if you don't know a lot, then the world appears simple to you, and you consequently think that you understand it. So people that don't know a lot think that they know quite a bit, because they're unaware of how stupid they actually are. Okay, so you see, kind of ignorance is, we in the previous presentation we said, ignorance is bliss, but ignorance is also kind of a prison. It's a self-imposed prison. It's like Plato's cave. It's a self-imposed prison that you don't even know that you're a prisoner in. Okay, you're so ignorant that you can't even begin to appreciate how ignorant you are. Okay, so those are kind of the two combinations there. So let me go back to this one. It is always wrong everywhere for anyone to believe in anything on insufficient evidence. So let me just unpack that a little bit. Is basically, if you go back even to Plato, this idea of what constitutes knowledge. What are the elements of knowledge? And this is generally accepted. Okay, what are the ingredients of knowledge? Knowledge requires, it is what is called justified true belief. Okay, so to know something, it must be true. Okay, but it's not enough to have an opinion that is true to say that you know it, because you can guess and end up being correct, but that doesn't mean that you knew it all along. In other words, if I go play roulette and I say the next number is black and it ends up being black, I can't truly say I knew and I told you that it was going to be black. In some sense, I guessed and I got lucky. That's very important. There's a difference between guessing and guessing correctly and knowing something. Okay, but when you guess and you guess correctly, you might have the tendency to think that you might convince yourself that because I guessed and it was correct, I must have known, which is not the case. So we need to distinguish sort of opinion, mere opinion, from knowledge. What is what I want to say here? So justified true belief is, it has to be whatever you claim. If it's knowledge, then it must be true. You have to believe that it's true. That's the kind of the psychological dimension. It would be strange to say something like, I know my name is Mike, but I don't believe it. Belief is the kind of the psychological aspect of, I know that it's true and I believe that it's true, but I also know why it has to be true. Okay. And so sort of the point that he's making with this first principle is you go from not knowing to knowing. Okay. And what most of us do, let's suppose we have this tendency, if somebody asks you a question and you actually don't know the answer, many of us will prefer just shooting out a guess, okay, hypothesizing what might happen, rather than saying, I don't know. We don't like to say that we don't know. So we would rather just, throw out a guess and hope that we are correct in our guess. We don't like to say that we don't know. So this is kind of like, and that goes back to Socrates. Socrates says, it's okay if you don't know, if you know that you don't know. That's fine. It's a fine position to be in. You shouldn't feel bad for not knowing, okay? But a lot of us don't like to admit that we don't know. So we will sort of fathom an answer. Socrates says, if you don't know, it's okay. If you know that you don't know. The problem is when you think you know, but you actually don't know. That's when we get in trouble. Okay, we have a kind of a false assurance in our knowledge, which isn't knowledge, and in our subsequent assumption of our skills and our capacity and our competency and so on. So the idea is you start in a position of not knowing, and you want to get to a position of knowing. And what most of us do, because we don't like to admit that we are in a position of not knowing, is we do this kind of hopscotch. Okay, we go from here to having an opinion on the matter, And then we say, maybe one day I will seek out knowledge. I will seek out information on my opinion, and I will turn my opinion into knowledge. So that's when you get even more confirmation bias, because you already have a conclusion. You already have a set idea in mind. And so I'm making it look like having an opinion is halfway to having knowledge. But really it's like not knowing, opinion is over here, and then knowledge is this big gap. So in some sense, what William Clifford is saying is, instead of going from not knowing to having an opinion, and then eventually trying to base your opinion in justification and turning it into knowledge, he says, stay at the position of not knowing and move straight from not knowing to knowing. Okay, do the full project. Okay, don't build, like, let's say you don't build the house halfway. Okay, when you start, you try to finish it. Let me try to put it a little bit more vulgar, manner, is especially in this day and age, nobody gives a fuck what you think. Okay, opinions are dime a dozen. No, just don't open your mouth unless you have something to say for which you have at least some basis in. So I guess that's kind of the practical way of understanding this, is if you don't know what you're talking about, which is probably most of the time, then remain silent. Listen rather than speak. There are a lot of people that are eager to speak when they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, let's proceed here. So let me give you some kind of concrete examples where a false belief carries with it obvious negative consequences. Okay, as I said earlier, he's going to say that it's still unethical. It's still, you're still, in some sense, morally tainted for having a belief, even if it doesn't have negative consequences. Let's say if you want to believe that the world is flat, that doesn't really, it's not really going to impact you to a major degree, you know what I mean, unless you're like spending too much money, you know, funding, I don't know, yeah, but it's sort of like a non-consequential belief in some sense, believing that the world is flat. But what he's going to say is, no, it's still bad, because having a false belief which is inconsequential nonetheless lays down a sort of an intellectual habit. Okay, you are not developing the correct intellectual virtues, and consequently, even though this particular belief, this particular atomic belief, is inconsequential, you are cultivating an intellectual habit which is in the long run potentially going to backfire and potentially going to be dangerous. Okay, so let me just there are many, okay, especially if we get into the whole world of pseudoscience and conspiracy theories, there are a lot of false beliefs that cost people, you know, time, money. They get conned out of money. It impacts their health and so on. Okay, so this is one interesting one is in 1966, District Attorney of Los Angeles County did a survey of how much money is spent on basically quack medicine, pseudoscientific practitioners promising, you know, a miracle cure for this and that and cancer and all this stuff. So much so that the U.S. Public Health Service had to actually, they had to have like a, let's say, a public campaign warning people of fake doctors. Okay, so you have this kind of shady character here. It's a pretty scary looking ad. Okay, beware the cancer quack. The reputable physician does not promise a cure, demand advance payment, and advertise. Okay, I love the second one, demand advance payment. Okay, so U.S. Public Health Service, you know, public health announcement. So he evaluated that, and I hope that this is for the entirety of the United States and not just the county of you know, Los Angeles County. But he said that it exceeded $2 billion in 1966. So again, I hope that it's nationwide and not one specific area. But you might say, well, what's the problem? You know, it's a capitalist society. You're free to believe what you want. You're free to spend your money as you wish. But there's a kind of an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is that actually exceeded the actual amount of money that was spent on actually researching the diseases. So that's regrettable, because you would rather believe in somebody who's telling you a convenient story rather than not give that person the money and give the money to actual scientific research, which may in the future actually produce a meaningful cure or therapy or treatment or whatever. So that's too bad. Okay, but you have to understand that, like, also the kind of the psychology of the individual is we want kind of fast food. We want answers, and that's part of the difficulty of science. Is the difficulty of science is that it's a kind of a slow, careful, conservative process. Science does not jump to conclusions, and especially if you are, let's say, terminally ill, it sucks if science tells you, let's say, with many medical conditions, they say, we know how to diagnose you and we know what the prognosis is, but we don't know how to help you. Okay. In other words, we're going to tell you, like, this is how much this is how what you have to look forward to, and this is how long you have to live, but we don't know how to fix you. Okay. You must understand that it's tempting when you're in a position like that to be sort of drawn in by anybody who's giving you a sliver of hope, and that is deliberately in some cases exploited. You will exploit people that are either non-discerning or vulnerable or desperate for whatever reason. Another one, and again, as I said, we can name a bunch of pseudosciences, conspiracy theories, false beliefs. African rhino. The African rhino is being poached. Why? Okay, it's not decorative. It's not ornamental. It's because the rhino horn is regarded specifically in ancient Chinese medicine, which is practiced all across Asia, China, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. This belief that the rhino horn is a sort of a miracle cure. Okay, has all kinds of wonderful properties. That has no scientific basis, because the rhino horn is made out of keratin, which is made out of the same thing that your fingernails are made out of, and you can eat you can munch on your fingernails all day long. It's not going to cure your hangover, and it's not going to cure your impotence, and it's not going to get rid of the terminal illness that you're diagnosed with. So you can imagine some people. One obvious impact is people who would forego modern medical treatment for all these sort of ancient therapies, which have no basis, and they are believed on kind of fallacy. Okay, the belief that, well, it's been practiced for so long, therefore it must be true. That's not how things are established. Okay, you do not establish the effectiveness of a molecule or a medicine by how long a belief has been held. People believe that the world was flat for millennia. People believe that the world was the center of the universe for thousands of years. Did not make it true or truer. Okay, that's not how things are established. So that's one regrettable consequence, is people may actually die because of their false beliefs. Now, you may always have the anomaly of the person who magically recovers, and they then also fallaciously attribute their recovery to whatever pseudoscience, alternative medicine that they're practicing in a kind of a non-critical way. But another regrettable consequence is that now this species is endangered. It's endangered for a nonsensical belief which has no basis. It has no basis because you are basically saying that the keratin found in a rhino horn has a medicinal property that other molecules of keratin do not have. Okay, so now you are sort of, we're getting into the magical. And if that were the case, then we have to basically rewrite. It goes against the conservatism of science. So you have to rewrite all the textbooks, because the textbooks are fundamentally wrong. There's something that we have not understood about, molecules. If a molecule originates in one place versus another place, it takes on completely different properties. We would have to sort of, our chemistry textbooks would be obsolete. So that doesn't seem to be very likely. And now, as a result of all these forces, black market economic forces and so on, the rhino horn is one of the most expensive black market commodities. And now, this is also a tragedy, is if you really wanted rhino horn, you can actually harvest and grow rhino horn sustainably, because it regrows in the same way that your fingernail regrows. But if you're, let's say, a poacher and you're already taking all these risks, Why would you want to tranquilize a rhino in order to take, let's say, just the top of its horn when you can just kill the rhino and, you know, dig the whole horn out of its face? Why would you want to leave with a piece of rhino horn that's worth $10,000 when you can leave with a piece of rhino horn that's worth $50,000 or $60,000? Okay, so again, beliefs that are demonstrably false, carrying with them real world negative consequences. Okay, very regrettable negative consequences, because now we're threatening the extinction of a very remarkable species for nothing at all. Okay, for fantasy. Vaccines. Okay, now here we have a resurgence. We have a resurgence of this, even with sort of COVID vaccine hesitancy. AstraZeneca gets a lot of bad publicity, and this gets kind of hyped up and so on. You had the whole sort of this whole thing that started not long ago with Andrew Wakefield, and then there were documentaries that came out, and now what you get is basically, again, this is not an individual choice, because if you look at, let's say, rates of vaccination for, let's say, measles, mumps, rubella, let's say in the state of California, I saw that a student had presented this graph in another class. The rates of vaccination over the course of the past decade are gradually, let's say, decreasing. They start around like 96%, then like 92, 90%. Then they start to drop under, 80, 85%. And then you have a problem, because once you drop below a certain amount of people being vaccinated, then herd immunity is lost. And so even the people that are vaccinated are no longer protected. There's something else that I want to add to that. So it becomes a kind of a public health problem, and you get the resurgence of things that were basically previously completely eradicated, like cases of measles and so on. There weren't any cases of measles for years and years and years. Okay, and now you have these occasional outbreaks. But now this is kind of a little bit of a side note, but you want to trust people with their intellectual autonomy to be able to figure out for themselves, so that you don't. And I feel the same way, as a libertarian in a sense. You don't want the government telling you what to do. But if everybody starts exaggerating and it becomes a public health crisis, then you have to make it into law. You have to require people to get vaccinated. And that's when that also opens up new fertile ground for conspiracies, because now, well, why am I being told to do this? You're being told to do it because you have the responsibility to do it on your own, and you abdicated that responsibility. You didn't do your homework properly, and now we have to require it. Okay, I would prefer that people are able to. And now I guess this comes down to, let's say, the necessity of quality available education to make people understand bullshit from to make people understand what is a non-expert and what is an expert. And so this is kind of basic training. Okay, when that goes out the window, you have people that will believe that they are experts because they watched a bad documentary on YouTube for an hour and a half, and they make these kind of big decisions. Like I gave the example the other day. There was about a week or 2 weeks ago, where the person stopped me as I was going into the shopping center to tell me that the medical masks that we wear for COVID-19 have worms in them. Like, as I said, he felt the need. It was so pressing. It was such a pressing morsel of information that he felt the need to. He's going to tell perfect strangers, But there are other issues that have not entered into his moral compass that are so pressing that he needs to, stop random people on the street to tell. Yeah. Now, again, vaccines is like we have a sort of a vaccine reluctance and hesitancy, because we take it. It's easy to take something for granted when you don't see what it has prevented. That's kind of like the Achilles heel of vaccines is nobody believes them because they work. You know what I mean? Because they work, we say, well, where's the threat? You know what I mean? But if you ask your grandparents how they feel about vaccines, they're going to say, yeah, give me every vaccine, because because they saw that stuff. Okay, they saw polio. Okay, they saw they saw this stuff that killed smallpox. Like, instead, this is eradicated. It's fascinating that this is not a statistical anomaly, that pre-vaccination and post-vaccination, all of a sudden it dropped to zero. It's not like this is just a coincidence. So you get the point. It's a clear link there. Anyway, we can go on and on with this, the psychology behind that. Let me just jump ahead here. So this is what he's going to say. Let me just get through the slide, and I want to talk about William James a little bit, because it's a very, I think, useful response to this. He says, no belief, however trifling or fragmentary it may seem, is ever truly insignificant. It prepares us to receive more of its like, confirms those that resemble it before, and weakens others. So gradually, it lays a stealthy train in our innermost thoughts, which may one day explode into overt action and leave its stamp upon our character forever. So that's what I said. It's kind of, he's talking more in terms of kind of intellectual virtues or habits that you are either forsaking or that you are cultivating. So he says everybody has this responsibility. He says it's not only the statesmen and philosophers that owe this duty to mankind. And this, I love this sentence. I think it's beautifully written. Every rustic who delivers in the village alehouse his slow, infrequent sentences may help to kill or keep alive the fatal superstitions which clog his race. That's fantastic. Okay, so basically, we are all beacons of information. We are all transmitting information. So when you kind of shoot out racial slurs or these sort of inappropriate jokes and this and that, or again, you just feel the need to just spew out your opinion in an uninformed way, that information is being conveyed. You are a source, to whatever proportion, however small, you are a source of information. People are hearing it, people are registering it, and people are bouncing that information alongside and potentially modifying their own ideas and their own beliefs. So again, this whole idea that before you speak, know what you're talking about. But now, again, I think the greater problem here, especially for our generation, is the fact that we've put sort of public discourse in the hands of private companies like Facebook and Twitter and so on, that we do not have, let's say, an intellectual, well-moderated forum. It's not even any individual can spew out information and retweet false ideas, but you actually have, let's say, institutions and agencies, like Cambridge Analytica, like bots that will actually do this. Like there was a case where there was like a South American dictator, like just won an election, and it was discovered that his whole sort of campaign, they had thousands, if not tens of thousands, of fake accounts that would publish stuff on social media and then like it and retweet it and use the algorithms, sort of hijacking the algorithms through this fake volume to make messages appear more popular and more predominant than they actually are. So you see, so that's a big problem, and that's one of the essay questions is the whole doomsday clock. What are the elements that are potentially leading us to this catastrophic event? And alongside climate change and environmental degradation, and alongside the ongoing risk of nuclear warfare, you have the third element, which is weaponized widespread misinformation. So it's a problem. False beliefs. Okay, 11 o'clock. A few more things to say here. So this is what he says. He says this other psychological cognitive bias, this tendency of thought that we have, is wishful thinking. We like to imagine things that are pleasing. So he tells the story of a man who owns a boat that carries people, let's say, across the Atlantic. Okay, he owns a shipping company, and he's an old man, and he's been in business for a long time, and he has this boat that has served him well. But when he looks at the boat, the damage and the need of repairs becomes apparent to him. And regrettably comes the subsequent consequence that he needs to repair this boat if he wants to keep loading up people and sending it across the Atlantic. But that also implies the cost of repair, which he doesn't want to think. So his desire or his displeasure at the thought of the cost of the repair makes him gradually undermine and sort of he's able to skillfully decrease the importance of the damages that need to be repaired. Oh, it's not that bad. It's a good ship that has served me well. It's never had any problems. And so that's wishful thinking. Okay, you gradually start to dilute, and fall prey to your own sort of illusions. You gradually start to tailor the evidence. You start to kind of avoid the unpleasant evidence, and you start to reinforce and highlight the pleasant evidence. And so this is what he says. He gives a kind of again, going back to the underlying intention. It's not the consequence that matters, but the underlying intention. He says, suppose two scenarios. Suppose the first scenario is the ship has obvious damage. He sells tickets, loads up the ship with passengers, and sends it across the Atlantic. And suppose it sinks. Is he liable? Here you have obvious consequences. You would say, yeah, of course he's liable. Okay. Even in our laws, you would say, let's say if an airplane crashes and there were clear avoidance, there was a clear avoidance of supervision and examination and protocols that weren't respected, of course there's liability. So here you would say, of course he's morally responsible. But he says, in the second scenario, he says, suppose there is clear damage, that the boat is dangerous, and he loads up the boat nonetheless and sends it across the Atlantic, and it doesn't sink. Is he morally responsible? In some sense, legally, he's not responsible, because you would only be responsible for actual consequences that happen. But William Clifford would say he's nonetheless morally responsible, because he is not right. He may stroke himself on the back. He may give himself a pat on the back and say, I'm smart because I knew that it wouldn't sink. And lo and behold, it did not sink. He would say, no, you're not smart and you're not knowledgeable. You are just a gambler. You gambled and you got lucky. Okay. So in other words, fundamentally, think about that behavior in the long run. The behavior in the long run is problematic. Okay, so he would say that nonetheless, this person is nonetheless morally responsible, even when the consequence is not observed. Okay. So actually, let me read that quote because it's a good quote. He says, so suppose the boat doesn't sink. Will that diminish the guilt of her owner? He says, not one jot. Let me go back here. Suppose the boat doesn't sink. Will that diminish the guilt of her owner? Not one jot. When an action is done once, it is done right or wrong forever. This is a good part. No accidental failure of its good or evil fruits can possibly alter that. And this is also good. He says, the man would not have been innocent. He would only have not have been not found out. Okay. So you would have been wrong. You just wouldn't know that you're wrong. Okay. Let me skip over this. Okay. Basically, he says there is this whole idea of there is power that comes from true knowledge, as we described it earlier. But there's also the illusion of power that comes from the illusion of knowledge. Okay, the illusion of knowledge is thinking that you know something when it's kind of hubris. Okay, you actually don't know it. The sense of power is the highest and best of pleasure when the belief on which it is founded is a true belief and has been earned by investigation, as we said, justified true belief. Okay, let's get into about 5-10 minutes here. Should be good. So this is what sort of William Clifford is going to say. William Clifford is going to say, again, we have to deal with things sort of pragmatically. We have to wager what are the likely consequences of my choices, rather than knowing for sure what's going to happen. And we don't, we have to take actions without knowing with certainty what will happen, but nonetheless you have to act. So this is a kind of, I'll give you 2 or 3 examples, but I like the example of, let's say, climate change. Is some people, especially people that are sort of climate change denialists and sort of invested in that, they call it global warming. Okay, they use the old wording of it, global warming, but they distort the fundamental issue. They turn it into, well, is climate change real or is it not real? And what William James is going to say, William James is going to say, the true question is not whether climate change is real or not real. The true question is, what will happen if it's real and you don't act on it versus what will happen if it's not real and you do act on it? That's the real question to ask. Okay. Is it real or is it not real? It's like, we're going to start debating over like modeling. Who cares about, what would you do based on the most radical modeling, and what would you do based on the most lenient modeling? What would you do based on, let's say, what would you do based on what you regard as the most likely modeling? Okay, and I guess there's meta studies on that. You take all the models and you average them out, and you say, this is, let's say, let's just assume that this is going to take place. Let's stop debating now whether it's going to take place or not take place. Let's just assume that the model is correct. What do we look forward to if we act on this model or if we ignore this model? You know what I mean? So I like this. Okay, is energy independence, sustainability, renewables, cleaner environment. But what if it's all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So let's kind of unpack what William James is going to say. He says it is not unreasonable to. This is very abstract. Okay, so if I ask you, what is William James's response to William Clifford? Again, he's not saying William Clifford is wrong. He's just saying we have to go a little bit lighter here. Don't give me this abstract account. I need it kind of fleshed out. So William James argues that it's not unreasonable to believe in hypotheses that cannot be known or established to be true, simply because we have to act on things without knowing that they are definitively true. So let me give you this kind of, one way to look at it is sort of this kind of Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician, asked the question, should you believe in God? And again, it's not a philosophical or scientific debate. Well, does God actually exist or doesn't exist? I'm going to believe in him if there's good reason for him to exist, or not believe in him if there isn't good reason to exist. Blaise Pascal looks at it differently. He says, what are the consequences of you believing in God and God existing versus you believing in God and God not existing? So there are basically, you have 4 squares, okay? You believe in God, let's say, that is to say, you wager on God's existence, or you wager that God does not exist. You don't believe in God, okay? And then how that reflects in the actual world and the matter of fact is either God exists or God does not exist. So let's look at the potential outcomes here, and you'll get the point. So let's say if you believe in God and God does exist, then that's an epic win. Okay, now we're assuming the sort of monotheistic Christian God, so on. But you believe in God, God exists, that you win. It's a big payout. Okay, if you do believe in God and God does not exist, for the most part, you would say it's a fail, but it's a no loss fail. You know what I mean? Unless you're, let's say, overly invested religiously and you give all your money, to the church or something like that. But usually let's say it's a loss, but it's not a big deal. Okay, you were wrong, but who cares? Okay, now suppose you don't believe in God and God exists. No, let me go with this one first. Suppose you don't believe in God and you're right that God doesn't exist. It's a meaningless win. Okay, it's like you're right, but who cares? Because let's say you're dead and you found out that God doesn't exist. You're dead, so you can't even boast about it. So you don't believe in God. God does not exist. You're right, but who cares? But now, if you don't believe in God and God does not exist, then that's an epic fail. Okay, you burn in hell forever. So what Blaise Pascal says is, if you consider not right or wrong, but looking at it as kind of a risk assessment, what do you stand to gain or what do you stand to lose? He says it's in your best interest to believe in God, because you stand to gain a lot more at not that much of a loss if a loss does occur. You have to think about it like an insurance policy. Okay, if you believe in God, then you stand to win a lot without losing that much. But if you don't believe in God, you stand to lose a lot without gaining that much. Okay, so it's more of a kind of an insurance policy. Maybe God wouldn't be pleased with this. He'd say, well, I have to let you, let's say St. Peter's there with a clipboard, and he says, I have to let you into heaven, but I'm not happy about it. I have to let you in on a kind of a technicality. In other words, you didn't really believe in God. You sort of minimally believed in God. Okay, you were hedging your bets. That's what it's called, hedging your bets. Okay, you're taking a kind of an insurance. Now take the sort of take this scenario and put climate change in it. Okay, so suppose you act on climate change, and climate change is real. Let's say they talk about, let's say we have to avoid so many parts per million, or a 2 degrees increase in global average temperature. Again, let's not talk about, well, what's the methodology of global average temperature, and let's suppose you just act on it. So if you do act on climate change, and climate change is real, then you've avoided the worst case scenario. Okay, and suppose you do act on climate change, and climate change isn't real, then, well, what do you stand to lose? You've maybe invested in infrastructure, prior to the optimal point of investment. You've bought solar panels and wind turbines when they were more expensive than if you would have waited a little while. You've laid off people that work in mining and petroleum. Potentially you impact industrial scale livestock farmers, and you do it sort of earlier than it should have been done. So yeah, there's a bit of an impact. But now suppose suppose you don't act on climate change, and this is kind of what you get with sort of a lot of the Republican Party in the United States is, we're not going to act on climate change, and because climate change isn't real, and therefore it's status quo as usual. Okay, the same patterns, the same industrial style. There is no energy revolution. There is no Green New Deal. Status quo. Okay, we're interested in maintaining status quo. And why bother compromising status quo if there's no basis for it? Okay, because if you don't act on climate change, and climate change is real, then look at the models. Okay, it's we're looking at potentially, I don't know, apocalypse. You want to turn the world into a desert. That's a possibility. So things to consider. Okay, worst case scenario. In this case, you would get absolutely the worst case scenario. Okay, which is, let's say Florida is underwater. Massive climate migration. So we'll see. Okay, so let me see if there's one more good quote here that I want to end with. I think it captures it. Let me see. I think it's where is it? Okay, yeah, Mark Twain. So it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. So that goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's if you reformulate it, it's better to take the time to go from non-belief and no opinion to a well-informed opinion, as best as one can have a well-informed opinion. Let's say, especially if you're not an expert on the matter, it's easier to go from non-opinion to knowledge, rather than take this kind of stepping stone, be fooled, having to now undergo the psychological agony of admitting that you were wrong, erasing and modifying your previous beliefs and replacing them with something that's better. Okay, it's easier to it's easier to acquire a good idea right off the bat than to have to modify an old idea or belief or a habit. Okay, so it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. Okay, good. Any questions or comments with regards to that? If not, we'll end it there. Any questions?